Under the white-hot glare of post-war Hollywood, two women embodied opposite dreams. Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed siren studio sold as destiny itself. Debbie Reynolds, the bright, unflappable girl next door who made audiences believe in happily ever after. Off camera, they were not rivals, but confidants. Shopping trips between set calls, whispered jokes at banquets, small kindnesses traded in a town that rarely remembered them. That is why, when the headlines arrived, the shock felt biblical. A plane fell from the sky, and grief cracked the marble of Elizabeth's life. Cameras camped outside her gate, flashbulbs devouring privacy. Eddie Fisher, the golden-throated crooner, America's husband by way of radio, stepped forward to console a widow who wasn't his wife. Hollywood loves a narrative. The press loves a villain. The roles were assigned in ink that would not wash off. Debbie, betrayed. Elizabeth, condemned. Eddie, a man rearranged by the story he chose. But this is not just the tabloid triangle. It is a map of an industry that weaponized intimacy, a studio system that fed on appetites, and a culture that taught millions whom to adore and whom to burn at the stake. Behind every photo was a contract. Behind every contract, a calculation. The women at its center paid in a currency the town spends freely: reputation. How does a friendship that once felt indestructible become the fuse for the loudest explosion of the 1950s? Who profited from the blast, and who spent the rest of their lives sweeping up glass? Tonight, we rewind the reel, not to gawk, but to understand the machine that turned private sorrow into global scandal, and the two stars brave enough to walk back into its light.
Before Hollywood turned their names into rival headlines, Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds were simply two girls who came of age in the dream factory, shaped by very different origins, yet destined to meet under the same spotlight. Debbie was born Mary Frances Reynolds in 1932 in the modest town of El Paso, Texas. Her parents were working class, struggling through the Depression years, and when the family later moved to California, the young girl grew up with very little luxury. What she did have was spirit, quick wit, a singing voice that charmed local audiences, and the kind of sunny disposition that made her the embodiment of small-town wholesomeness. Church choirs and school performances became her earliest stage, and even then, her ability to make people smile marked her as different. Elizabeth, in stark contrast, entered the world in 1932 in Hampstead, London, to affluent American parents. By the time war clouds gathered over Europe, the family relocated to Los Angeles, where her mother's ambition soon guided Elizabeth toward the film studios. MGM executives immediately recognized something magnetic in the child: the striking violet eyes, the porcelain features, the gravity far beyond her years. At age 10, she was already under contract, her path paved not by chance, but by a studio system eager to mold her into a starlet. Their childhoods reflected the archetypes they would later play on screen. Debbie's humble background and resourcefulness bred resilience. Elizabeth's privileged upbringing and early exposure to fame gave her a confidence that could be mistaken for arrogance. One girl represented innocence, the other sophistication, and together they mirrored two sides of America's post-war dream. Yet the most important detail of their backgrounds lies not in difference, but in convergence. Both families, though worlds apart economically, instilled in their daughters a belief in hard work and destiny. Both young women were thrust into Hollywood in their teenage years, forced to navigate an industry that consumed youth and beauty at a merciless pace. Their shared experience as child performers in the studio system would become the foundation of their early friendship, a bond strong enough, at least for a time, to withstand the pressures of a world that expected them to be rivals rather than allies. It was within this crucible of ambition, expectation, and carefully constructed images that Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds first forged their connection. Before scandal and betrayal tore them apart, their friendship was celebrated as genuine, rare, and almost naively hopeful. Two young women, each carrying the weight of family dreams and studio contracts, looked at each other across the blinding lights of Hollywood and saw not competition, but a kindred spirit. The journey from promising youth to recognized star was never straightforward, even in the golden age of Hollywood. For Debbie Reynolds, the road began in the most unassuming way: a local beauty contest in Burbank. At just 16, she entered the Miss Burbank pageant for fun, with no expectation beyond a laugh. Instead, she won, and with that crown came the attention of Warner Brothers studio scouts. Soon after, she was signed to MGM, where the studio sensed in her a fresh, all-American innocence that audiences could not resist. Her breakthrough came with a role that seemed tailor-made for her spirit. In 1952's Singin' in the Rain, she played Kathy Selden, a wide-eyed ingenue opposite Gene Kelly and Donald O'Connor. Debbie had no formal dance training, and Kelly's demanding rehearsals left her bleeding in her shoes. Yet she persevered, channeling grit into charm, and delivered a performance that would be immortalized as one of cinema's greatest musicals. Overnight, she was no longer just a contest winner, but a true Hollywood darling. Elizabeth Taylor's entry into stardom had been more carefully orchestrated. MGM had placed her under contract after seeing the potential in her child roles, but it was Father of the Bride in 1950, when she was just 12, that made her a household name. The film's success transformed Elizabeth into the studio's most bankable adolescent star, and MGM wasted no time in cultivating her image. Throughout the late 1940s, she was cast in films that highlighted her beauty, but by the 1950s, she fought to be seen as more than just a face. In Father of the Bride in 1950, and its sequel, Father's Little Dividend in 1951, Elizabeth displayed a maturity that belied for years, bridging the gap between child star and serious actress. Hollywood audiences, watching her grow up on screen, began to view her less as the girl next door and more as an emblem of sophistication and allure. By the time Debbie Reynolds was dazzling the world with her dancing and Singin' in the Rain, Elizabeth was already being hailed as one of the most beautiful women alive, her violet eyes becoming legend. Their early careers reflected a fateful symmetry. Debbie embodied accessibility, plucky, charming, down-to-earth. Elizabeth personified unattainable glamour, enigmatic, refined, a woman destined for center stage. Yet these differences became the glue of their friendship. They moved in the same circles, attended the same Hollywood gatherings, and often leaned on each other as young women in an industry that demanded perfection while offering little kindness. It was during these early successes that Eddie Fisher entered their orbit. Already a celebrated singer with a velvet voice, Fisher was adored by female fans and marketed as America's ideal husband. When he and Debbie married in 1955, they seemed to form the perfect American couple, two wholesome stars with adoring audiences. At the same time, Elizabeth was navigating her own marriages and an increasingly complicated personal life. The stage was quietly being set, though neither friend could have predicted how dramatically the script would turn.
By the mid-1950s, Hollywood was experiencing one of its most glamorous decades. The studio system was still intact, and movie stars were not simply entertainers, they were living myths. At the very center of this shimmering constellation stood Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds, each commanding her own kingdom of adoration. For Debbie Reynolds, Singin' in the Rain had already secured her place in Hollywood history. Yet she proved she was not merely a one-hit wonder. Throughout the late 1950s, she blossomed into the embodiment of the all-American girl. Films such as Tammy and The Bachelor, 1957, showcased her singing and acting, producing the hit song Tammy that topped the Billboard charts for weeks. Her wholesome image, infectious optimism, and sparkling screen presence made her a household name, beloved by mothers, daughters, and young men alike. To the public, Debbie was not just a performer, she was America's sweetheart, innocence wrapped in laughter.
At the same time, Elizabeth Taylor was scaling an altogether different summit. Already considered one of the most beautiful women in the world, she fought to establish herself as a serious actress. Her performances in Giant, 1956, opposite James Dean and Rock Hudson, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, 1958, opposite Paul Newman, proved beyond doubt that she was more than a studio-manufactured starlet. Critics hailed her emotional depth, her fiery screen presence, and the effortless way she carried herself as if born for cinematic immortality. She became one of MGM's most valuable assets, commanding enormous salaries and drawing millions to the box office. By now, the contrast between Debbie and Elizabeth had become symbolic. Debbie represented purity, a girl from humble beginnings who never lost her sense of sincerity. Elizabeth embodied sophistication, wealth, and a sensuality that was often labeled dangerous. Together, they mirrored the split personality of post-war America. Innocence versus temptation. Small-town dreams versus cosmopolitan allure. Yet off-screen, their friendship remained warm. They lunched together, attended social gatherings side by side, and openly supported each other. It seemed unthinkable that scandal could one day fracture their bond. Meanwhile, Eddie Fisher's career was soaring in parallel. With his golden voice, he was one of the most popular male singers of the era, his records selling millions, his face gracing television screens. His marriage to Debbie in 1955 appeared to cement Hollywood's fairy tale narrative, the girl-next-door princess and the charming crooner. They soon had 2 children, Carrie and Todd Fisher, completing the picture of domestic bliss. To the public eye, Eddie and Debbie were the ideal American couple, the antidote to the chaos of a rapidly changing world. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was experiencing turbulence in her personal life. Her marriage to producer Mike Todd in 1957 was passionate and glamorous, capturing the imagination of the press. Todd was charismatic, wealthy, and adored Elizabeth without reservation. Their union seemed to silence critics who whispered about Elizabeth's multiple marriages. For once, she appeared happy, grounded, and in love. Debbie and Eddie were close friends of the couple, and the four were often seen together. 2 golden Hollywood pairs, glittering like characters in a fairy tale. But fairy tales have a way of curdling under the relentless flash of camera bulbs. In March 1958, tragedy struck. Mike Todd's private plane, the Liz, crashed, killing everyone aboard. Elizabeth was widowed at just 26, left to raise their daughter alone. The entire world grieved with her, yet behind the condolences, the story began to shift. Eddie Fisher, the best man at Elizabeth's wedding to Mike Todd, stepped forward to console her. In those tender, grief-stricken months, lines blurred. Sympathy gave way to intimacy. A friendship between 2 couples spiraled into a scandal that no studio could contain. Still, in the late 1950s, before betrayal became public, the careers of Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor glittered like few others. Debbie's girl-next-door image remained untarnished, her films and music cementing her status. Elizabeth was earning Academy Award nominations, hailed as one of the finest actresses of her generation. The 2 women, once side by side as Hollywood sisters, now stood at their peaks, unaware that the storm brewing would soon pit their names against each other in headlines so explosive that the movies themselves seemed to shrink in comparison. For a brief, shimmering moment, both Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds lived in the purest form of Hollywood glory, adored by millions, applauded for their talent, and basking in the illusion of everlasting success. But behind the curtain, destiny was preparing its cruelest plot twist, a triangle of love, betrayal, and public humiliation that would define their legacies as much as their art.
The fall of Mike Todd's plane in March 1958 shattered more than Elizabeth Taylor's world. It sent shockwaves through the Hollywood elite. Todd, larger than life and endlessly devoted to Elizabeth, had been the kind of husband who made the tabloids root for her. His sudden death left her widowed at 26, a mother to their infant daughter, and the most photographed grieving woman in America. Newspapers plastered her image on front pages, Elizabeth veiled in black, eyes swollen with sorrow. The public rallied around her, offering sympathy and compassion. But sympathy can be a dangerous currency in Hollywood. Eddie Fisher, Todd's best friend and Debbie Reynolds' husband, stepped forward to console Elizabeth. At first it appeared noble, a man comforting a widow, a friend honoring a fallen comrade. Debbie, with 2 young children at home, trusted that her husband's closeness to Elizabeth came from loyalty, not betrayal. What she could not know was that grief and vulnerability had opened a door that neither Eddie nor Elizabeth would close. By late 1958, whispers began circulating. The tabloids smelled scandal. Photographers captured Eddie visiting Elizabeth's home late at night. Studio executives, desperate to protect their investments, instructed their stars to deny everything. But the truth was impossible to contain. Eddie had left Debbie for Elizabeth, and in doing so, detonated one of the loudest scandals Hollywood had ever known. The press turned it into spectacle. Elizabeth was branded a homewrecker, accused of stealing her best friend's husband. Debbie became the wronged wife, paraded across magazine covers as the picture of wounded innocence. Eddie, once America's golden boy, was vilified as weak, opportunistic, and foolish. The triangle dominated headlines not just in Hollywood, but around the world, becoming a global morality play in which everyone was forced to take sides. The betrayal cut deeper because of the friendship that had once defined the 2 women. Debbie and Elizabeth had shared dressing rooms, vacations, confidences. They had laughed about the absurdities of Hollywood, leaned on each other when studio demands grew unbearable. To lose a husband was one thing. To lose a friend to that husband was a wound almost too raw to speak of. Years later, Debbie would admit that she learned about the affair the way most people did, from the newspapers. Eddie Fisher's career never recovered. Once adored, he was now despised by audiences who saw him as the man who destroyed America's sweetheart. Concert bookings declined, record sales plummeted. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's career remained remarkably resilient. Though her personal life was condemned, her talent on screen was undeniable. In 1960, she starred in Butterfield 8, a role that mirrored the public's perception of her as a troubled seductress, and won her first Academy Award. Scandal had threatened to destroy her, but perversely, it only added to her mystique. For Debbie, the years after the betrayal were grueling. Left to raise Carrie and Todd Fisher alone, she juggled motherhood with relentless work. She accepted film roles, television appearances, and nightclub performances, anything to keep her family afloat. Though wounded, she carried herself with dignity, refusing to descend into public mudslinging. The audience adored her all the more for it, casting her as the eternal victim, a saintly figure wronged by fate. Behind the headlines, however, the reality was far less theatrical. Elizabeth and Eddie's marriage, cemented in 1959, was volatile and short-lived. What began in passion and tragedy dissolved quickly in jealousy and discontent. Within a few years, Eddie was eclipsed not only by Elizabeth's fame, but by her next great scandal, the affair with Richard Burton on the set of Cleopatra. By the early 1960s, Eddie was history, Elizabeth was scandal-proof, and Debbie was left with scars the public would never fully see. The conflict between the 2 women became Hollywood legend, whispered about in studio corridors and splashed across gossip columns. Yet beneath the gossip, it revealed something profound about the machinery of fame. Private sorrow had been transformed into public theater. Studios and tabloids fed on betrayal, ensuring that what might have been a personal tragedy became a cultural event. Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds were no longer just actresses. They were archetypes, temptress and betrayed wife, locked into roles they had not chosen but could not escape. What makes this conflict endure in memory is not simply the scandal itself, but its humanity. It was not a feud concocted by studios for publicity. It was real pain, real betrayal, and real loss. Two women who had once trusted each other implicitly found themselves standing on opposite sides of a story too big to control. Theirs was a friendship consumed by grief, desire, and betrayal, and Hollywood made sure the world never forgot it.
The marriage between Elizabeth Taylor and Eddie Fisher, forged in grief and scandal, never stood a chance of becoming the fairy tale they claimed it to be. From the beginning, it was tainted by public outrage and private unease. Eddie had sacrificed his reputation, his fans, and his career for Elizabeth, but she was a woman the world could never truly possess. The passion that burned hot in the aftermath of Mike Todd's death soon flickered under the weight of jealousy, resentment, and the relentless scrutiny of the press. By the early 1960s, fissures appeared. Eddie, once one of America's most beloved singers, struggled to find work. Audiences who had once cheered him now booed. The scandal had not only stripped him of Debbie Reynolds' wholesome glow, it had cast him as Hollywood's villain, a role he could not shake. Elizabeth, meanwhile, continued to soar. Her performance in Butterfield 8 won her the Academy Award for Best Actress in 1961, and though many suspected it was a consolation prize, it confirmed her as one of the greatest stars of her generation. Fame insulated her from the fallout that destroyed Eddie. Then came Cleopatra. The production was beset with delays, ballooning budgets, and a romance that eclipsed everything else. Elizabeth Taylor met Richard Burton on set, and the two ignited one of the most notorious affairs in cinema history. Eddie Fisher was humiliated, discarded as swiftly as he had once discarded Debbie. By 1964, Elizabeth divorced Eddie to marry Burton, leaving Fisher adrift and nearly forgotten. For Debbie, the tragedy had unfolded differently. The betrayal had broken her marriage, but she refused to break. She raised her two children, Carrie and Todd, with resilience, working tirelessly to support them. Though she too endured failed marriages and financial troubles in later years, she rebuilt her life with determination. The public, moved by her dignity, continued to admire her as the embodiment of strength in the face of humiliation. Yet beneath the glamour and the headlines, the tragedy was stark. 3 lives had been upended. Eddie Fisher's once glorious career never recovered. He would spend the rest of his life overshadowed by scandal. Elizabeth Taylor, despite her legendary status, carried the weight of criticism. Her personal life often threatened to eclipse her immense talent. And Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart, bore the scars of betrayal even as she fought to reinvent herself. The love triangle that had once fascinated the world ended not in triumph but in disillusionment. What had been framed as passion and destiny was revealed as heartbreak and ruin. Hollywood had consumed another story, another set of lives, leaving behind broken marriages, fractured friendships, and careers reshaped by scandal. Time, as it often does, softened the edges of betrayal. In the decades following their very public rupture, Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds lived lives that, while divergent, remained entangled in the cultural imagination. For years they avoided each other, their once bright friendship reduced to a symbol of Hollywood's most infamous triangle. Yet, as both women aged, perspective began to replace bitterness. It was during the 1980s, at a chance meeting on a cruise ship, that the long-frozen silence finally cracked. Debbie later recalled that she simply walked up to Elizabeth, extended her hand, and said, "Let's move on." Elizabeth, weary from her own string of heartbreaks and health struggles, agreed. After decades of estrangement, the two women reconciled. The tabloids, which had once feasted on their feud, now celebrated their unlikely truce. This reconciliation gave the story its final twist, not one of rivalry, but of resilience. Elizabeth and Debbie, once pitted against each other as victim and villain, were no longer willing to let the past define them. They appeared together at charity events, even sharing a stage to raise funds for AIDS research, a cause close to Elizabeth's heart. Their public forgiveness served as a reminder that beneath the glitter and scandal, they were, in the end, human beings who longed for peace. The legacy of their rivalry is double-edged. On one hand, it remains a cautionary tale about the destructive power of fame, betrayal, and the voracious appetite of tabloids. On the other, it endures as a lesson in survival and forgiveness. Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds never erased the pain of the past, but they proved that even the deepest wounds could heal when pride is set aside. Their story continues to fascinate because it reflects not only Hollywood's hunger for spectacle, but also the universal themes of friendship, love, betrayal, and redemption. From dazzling premieres to the darkest betrayals, the story of Elizabeth Taylor and Debbie Reynolds reminds us that even the brightest stars cast shadows. They were more than rivals in a love triangle. They were women navigating an industry that turned their private heartbreak into public entertainment. And yet, against all odds, they found a way back to forgiveness, proving that grace can outlast scandal. As we look back on their journey, from friendship to feud, from betrayal to reconciliation, we are left with a question. In a world built on illusions, how much of Hollywood's drama belongs to the screen, and how much belongs to real, fragile hearts? If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love Hollywood's hidden history, and subscribe to Beyond the Red Carpet for more untold truths behind the spotlight.